Bring it, babe, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Bring it, babe, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Bring it, babe, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it. Bring it, babe, turn it, leave it, stop,
And so I was trying
no idea
to.
what that was.
That's okay. I told you I'd come up with something different for next episode, but either way, I am done with. Let me just here. I'll show you my final product here. The other day when we were in a meeting and you got really mad and suspicious of everyone else in the meeting, I captured that image in my head and then I redrew it on paper. So just want to show everyone.
That looks like a character from World of Warcraft.
It very well could be. It very well could be. All I know is that that's how you looked, and I said I needed to recreate that.
Did you ever play World of Warcraft?
Did you?
Dude, so for like a month in college, I played World of Warcraft. And I had to stop because it was so addicting that I was like, I'm going to lose my entire life to this game. So after I paid for my first month, I had to just like cold turkey because it was so addicting. It was just, and I'm going to tie this really quickly into what we're going to talk about today. It keys in on every basic reward system that we know of. It's like the dopamine, the variable reward, the like everything is, it like kind of taps into that flow state where it's like the next thing is a little too hard to do immediately, but if you just spend another 20 minutes, you can accomplish it. And then it's always like that. So you're just like always 20 minutes away from the next thing. And it was just, dude, it would suck an entire weekend of my life.
Knowing what I know about you too, that's exactly how your brain works. Because I know you, and you're just like, oh, that's the next thing. Well, I can't not go accomplish that. Like that is like your style. Like you have to like tackle the next thing and just go for it. So that's really funny. But you were addicted to Halo, right?
Yes. For basically from about
let it be known that he was addicted to Halo.
15 until probably 21. I was either playing basketball or I was playing Halo. It was bad. It was very bad.
Should we get started now that we've been rambling and people want us to shut up and continue?
Yes.
We are going to cover all about carbohydrates in this episode, everyone. So thank you to those who are already here and watching. I would also like to let you know that we do field questions. We have a bunch of questions that we're going to get to that I asked people to ask in the group earlier, and we got a bunch of them, but we might be able to fit more. So if you guys have questions as we're going throughout the show, drop them in the comment section. We'll be able to see them and we'll answer them. So like I said, this is going to be a really good topic because people are afraid of carbohydrates. Not everyone, but a lot of people. So we're going to dispel myths. We're going to discuss what carbohydrates are. Brad's going to bring his scientific lens into the equation. That's probably where everyone will just fall asleep, but pretend that you're paying attention, and we'll make it fun too. I mean, we'll probably watch Brad eat some oatmeal or something exciting like that. But let's get to it. We know everyone loves well, not everyone, but I love carbs. Before we start, let me ask you, what's your favorite carbohydrate? And when I say carb, I don't like not whole foods. Like if you're going to eat junk food, what's your go-to carbohydrate? Mine's ice cream, and I know that has fat and protein in it too, but I'm saying ice cream is a carb.
So I was going to say, I think that's one of the misconceptions when we'll talk about today is most people think junk food is carbohydrates. But if you look at most of the junk food we eat, it has more of its calories from fats than carbohydrates. Now,
true.
My favorite food in the entire world is ice cream with a waffle cone. In fact, fun fact about me, last year when I went through the all of my transactions on my credit card for the last year, I did like a pivot table to be like, oh, where did I spend the most money? the most like amount of transactions, not in like total dollar amounts, but like frequency, was the ice cream place in Sandpoint, Idaho. I did not go nearly as many times this year. I went so many times last year. Like every time we went into town, I was just like, I don't care. I'm stopping for ice cream. And sometimes I would just get a waffle cone, but oh God, it was so good.
I think ice cream and pizza are the two perfect foods. If you think about it, they both have what you need. Ice cream has carbs, fats, and protein. And then pizza, you've got your carbs, you've got your protein, and your veggies. Are those not the two perfect foods?
I mean, I could live without pizza. I couldn't live without ice cream.
Oh man, I can't believe you. So let's start with the basics. Carbohydrates. They are one of the three macronutrients. It's the body's preferred fuel source. Why do we call it the preferred fuel source? Is it simply because it's the most readily available? Like that's just the easiest, quickest place to get, immediate energy for your body's cells? Or is there more to it than that?
So carbohydrates are kind of considered the preferred energy source of the body, especially for physical activity, for two reasons. One, it provides energy much faster than we get energy from metabolizing fats. That's the first piece. The second piece is there are certain types of like reactions that we need to produce energy without oxygen. And you can use carbohydrates to produce energy without oxygen, which is why we call it anaerobic metabolism. So there's certain cells in your body that don't have great oxygen perfusion. There's certain just types of cells in your body that prefer to not use oxygen heavy because they just don't have a lot of mitochondria in them, just for various reasons. So those are kind of the two main reasons that our body will prefer carbohydrates at certain times, is a lack of oxygen and the speed of needing to create energy.
I had a thought that I wanted to tack onto that, but we can save that. How do you define a carbohydrate? If someone, and let's just say for the average person, right? Someone comes to you, Brad Dieter, and says, Brad, tell me what a carbohydrate is. What's your explanation to them?
So we define carbohydrates based on structure, right? And they differ from fats and proteins in their structure and how they're stored in the body. So carbohydrates fundamentally get boiled down to the most simple structure of a carbohydrate is a sugar molecule. And that needs to be understood from the perspective of like chemistry, not how we talk about it in layman's terms. So carbohydrates, carbohydrates have sugar or basically sugars, which are things like glucose, which is a simple sugar, galactose, which is a simple sugar, maltose, which is a simple sugar, and fructose. So those are the four main types of simple sugars. And then when we think about sugars ourselves, like table sugar is actually called sucrose, which is one glucose molecule bonded to a fructose molecule. So that's what we call like sugar, right? The sugar that's in beer is maltose, right? Lactose, which is the sugar that's in milk, is actually also a disaccharide. It is galactose and glucose. So we've got these basically very basic, simple sugars, and those combine to make the more complex ones.
And so there's sugars, there's starches, fiber is considered a carbohydrate as well. So we're really just talking about different structures, but they all must share something in common, right? So like they all share like the basic structure, which is what?
A sugar molecule. One of those four sugar molecules.
That's just
basically.
Okay.
And so like what really makes the difference is how they're connected together. So if you look at like
the molecular chain, basically.
Yeah. So if you look at the difference between starch and fiber, they're all glucose. It's just the way that they are bonded together is different. So our body has enzymes that can break down the bonds in starch, which is the way the glucose molecules are. Let's say here's a glucose molecule. two of them, they're bonded together, and there's a whole bunch of them, that would be starch. Our body has the enzyme that can break that apart. Now, if they're bonded like this, that's a different type of bond, and our body doesn't have the enzyme to break that bond, then it's fiber. That's kind of like the easiest way to think about it.
Yeah, I was just the other day over the weekend, I was watching my dog eat grass, and they say that dogs eat grass if they have like a stomach ache or whatever, but that's beside the point. But I was thinking, okay, what is grass? I mean, it would be an insoluble fiber to us. We don't have the enzyme to digest grass.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that's just because of the molecular structure of grass, but maybe some animals do have the capability to break that down and other types of fiber that we cannot break down.
Yeah. And let me just correct a simple mistake. The 4 simple sugars are fructose, galactose, glucose, and lactose. Maltose, which is the sugar we find in beers, 2 glucoses put together. I think I said maltose was a simple sugar, but it's just 2 glucose ones.
What are you doing? You cannot make mistakes on this show.
I know.
You're not allowed to.
Happens.
Oh boy, even pros make mistakes. I'm just kidding. So
good thing I'm not a professional, so it's fine.
We know. Let's talk before we go further. Simple carbs and complex carbs. I'm interested in knowing. So simple versus complex also must have to do with their structure.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe complex carbs maybe have a longer molecular chain, and that's probably why they take longer to break down. Probably not much longer if I had to guess. But what I'm interested in is how those impact blood sugar, and like, do they actually impact blood sugar levels as much as you would think? Because I can't imagine that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the difference between a simple and a carb and a complex carb, the molecular structure wouldn't be so different that simple carbs cause, such an acute rise in blood sugar levels that it's something to be concerned about versus complex. Am I wrong, or am I on the right thinking about that?
Sort of. So what we know about like consuming simple sugars versus complex sugars, well, the simple carbohydrates versus complex carbohydrates, is when we digest them, the complex carbohydrates require more enzymes to free up all of the like multiple simple sugars hooked together. So it just takes more enzyme work, and it takes longer to fully digest it for them to get absorbed, right? So you're basically going to have a slow bleed of these carbohydrates into your system versus all at once. Like if you just chug sugar water, it's going to get broken down super quick and it's going to show up in your body, right? So this is why we see a big glucose spike. If you consume the same amount of glucose in a starch, it's just going to be a slower peak. It's going to take longer. So that's the difference between like glycemic index and glycemic load. And so it really just has to do with the total glucose load and how long it takes. Now, what's really interesting is those are ideas that appear to be like good in theory, but it turns out there's a huge amount of variance in how our bodies process different types of food and sugar and get absorbed, right? Some people will digest complex carbohydrates much faster than others based on their like genetics. So like some people have very different amounts of amylase genes, so that shows up in your saliva and in your digestion. So those people will break down like complex carbohydrates faster, and other people won't. So it'll be very different. And what was really interesting is there was a study published in 2015 where they took a whole bunch of people and they hooked them up to continuous glucose monitors, and they had them eat like glucose, just like consume straight sugar. Then they had them eat a complex carbohydrate, which was bread. And then they had them eat fructose, which is a slightly different sugar. And they had them eat like bananas and cookies and stuff. And what was interesting is there was very wide variations in exactly how that glucose showed up in their blood, whether it was all at once super quick or whether it took longer. So like some people had a very high glycemic response to a banana, and other people had almost none. Some people had a very high response to the bread, and some people had almost none.
That's interesting. So do we necessarily, what I'm taking away from this is we don't necessarily need to worry too much about simple versus complex. I mean, unless you have a medical reason to do so.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. One is just understanding that the glycemic load or the glycemic index or the let's just call it total glucose load your body experiences from eating an individual food doesn't necessarily have any meaningful impact on your ability to lose weight, manage calorie intake, etc.
Right.
Where it can be important is, if you have metabolic issues, like if you have type 2 diabetes or you have type 1 diabetes, and you do use things like insulin to manage how your glucose levels respond to food, like understanding how your body responds differently to different types of carbohydrates, whether they're simple or complex, is important. The other one is if you're an athlete preparing for a competition, like understanding that can be really important because the amount of glucose and the kinetics of how it goes up and goes down based on how your body responds to a food, how your body responds to exercise, etc., can actually meaningfully impact your ability to perform.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I think we might come back to some of that a little bit later. But do people need to worry about? I mean, let's talk food sources. Just so for people who aren't really sure, okay, we've defined complex versus simple. Some examples of complex carbs would be things like, I mean, naming one of your favorites, oatmeal. Simple carbs would be pure sugary treats. Those, and it kind of goes back to the 80-20 rule, in my opinion. If 80% of your diet is whole foods and the good foods, the remaining 20% can kind of be whatever. It's maybe better to pay attention, kind of keep that in mind versus fretting about I need to eat simple or complex, and maybe just treating it as more of an 80-20 rule.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's always important to remember is the context of what you're consuming.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, you can consume a food that is fairly high in simple sugars relative to its calorie content, and it can be a really good food choice. For example, an apple. Almost all of an apple's calories come from simple sugars, which is fructose and glucose.
Right.
But it also has high water content, high fiber content. It's not super palatable. It's very low energy density. It's got high satiety. So the likelihood of you substantially over consuming calories from eating an apple is very low, right?
Right.
Conversely, I can think of things that have a lot of complex carbohydrates, but you could like massively over consume them, right? Take, like a donut has a lot of starch in it, hyper palatable, very calorie dense, very low satiety,
Low volume.
etc. Yeah. So it's really about the context of it. And I think probably the better way to think about it is a little bit of like, this is where the whole foods versus refined processed foods argument starts to actually make a little bit of sense in terms of a food decision tree. Generally speaking, whole food sources tend to have lower energy density, higher nutrient density, lower palatability, greater satiety, whereas refined and processed food sources generally tend to have higher energy density, lower nutrient density, higher palatability, lower satiety. And what ends up happening is a lot of times more refined and processed sources generally have a higher rate of simple sugars, generally in the form of like high fructose corn syrup, which, I mean, if we want to talk about that now, we can, or we can come back to it.
Let's come back to it because I want to get into some of the misconceptions that people have about carbs. These are questions that we get all the time, and we'll circle back to that one. But real quick, why would we want to go keto or low carb when you find out that the brain, its primary fuel source is carbohydrates, right? Wouldn't keto or low carb therefore be bad for your brain? I mean, bad for lack of a better word, but you know what I'm saying, right? If that's the main fuel source, it seems like it would be not beneficial to reduce your carbs when that's what the brain wants.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those. I honestly think this is one of those red herrings / not really relevant parts of the discussion of ketogenic diets. I mean,
Okay.
yes, your brain relies more heavily on glucose than other parts of your body. Your brain can also run on ketones. So when you produce ketones in your body, you can make up some of that energy deficit from going low carb to to ketones. The other thing is your body has a very narrow window in which it can survive having glucose. Like 60, anything below 60 milligrams per deciliter is pretty bad. Like you could die. Generally, you can survive around that, but if it gets lower and lower, like your likelihood of surviving glucose levels below 60 gets much lower. Conversely, in a more chronic sense, if it's above 100, bad things start to happen. So you actually have, I mean, take out a deciliter of water and then take 40 milligrams of sugar, and you can see like how little like room for error there is in that. So even when you're consuming almost no carbohydrates in your diet, your body has to manufacture it from something, right?
Right.
So even when you're going low carb, keto, whatever, your body's still maintaining some level of sugar in your body because it has to have it. Now, the real reason that ketogenic diets become very popular is one, the initial success of them conceptually is off the charts, right? When you go from eating a standard diet that's, let's call it 50, 60% carbohydrates, and you basically go to less than 50 grams a day, the first 3 to 6 weeks involves a lot of water weight loss, and you're depleting your body of glycogen. We know within a couple weeks, especially if you're physically active, your glycogen stores go to, I mean, roughly half, right? That's a good rule of thumb. Sometimes it's only 70%. Some people it's like 30%. Like it just varies, but roughly half, which means you lose probably 6 to 10 pounds of just water weight. And glycogen you would consider water weight because it's just like it's wet tissue in your body. So they have this very big initial like, oh my God, this was really great. I lost a lot of weight.
Right.
And then the other piece why they're successful is whenever you remove an entire food group, which is effectively what you're doing, you generally tend to lower your total calorie intake. So you continue to lose weight after that. It has almost nothing to do with the carbohydrates themselves. There's no real boost in weight loss due to insulin being lower. There's no real weight loss effect due to having high ketone levels. Like none of that is actually true.
And so we're not actually, I think, what the main takeaway that people should be aware of is that you're not actually losing fat, is what you're saying, right?
You're losing some fat, but you're losing the same amount of fat you would be at a calorie deficit of any other diet. Carbs. You're just seeing an additional water weight loss.
But I'm also saying that 5 or 10 pounds or whatever in the first couple of weeks, that's not 5 or 10 pounds of fat. There might be some fat in there, but it's largely outweighed by the water. We did get a comment from Sherry. She says, "Good afternoon from Oregon." Not far from you, Bradley.
Yes. What part of Oregon? I want to know.
She didn't say. She just said, "Good afternoon from Oregon." So Sherry, thank you for watching, and good afternoon to you as well. Benefits of carbohydrates. Let's dive into the benefits of them. We know that we've talked about how they deliver energy to our muscles, particularly for athletes, which you kind of alluded to earlier. Maybe we can, well, let me back up a second. Do you want to, because this is actually going to segue into something that I was going to mention. So maybe we do talk about high fructose corn syrup right here, if there was a point you wanted to make. You want me to play some music? Go for it.
No, I don't want you to
let's dive into I'll piggyback off of that, but I'm curious to hear what you were going to say on the high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah. So what's really interesting is table sugar, which is what, like, if you were to just look up sugar, that's basically what it is, right? The stuff in the white sugar cubes, that is glucose and fructose at 50-50 ratios. High fructose corn syrup is 45% glucose, 55% fructose. So it's basically the same thing as table sugar, except for you have slightly more fructose in there because it makes it more soluble. So it's like easier to, dissolve in water, which is why we use it in syrups, beverages, things like that. And it's slightly sweeter. So if you eat just straight glucose, which is basically what rice is, I mean, it's a lot of that's in the starch form, but like just free glucose itself is not very sweet. Fructose has a much sweeter taste to it. So that's why we use it, for the taste and for the just like solubility / dissolvability. But
Sure,
what
it's
that,
cheaper too.
yeah, well, and it's cheaper to manufacture. But what that
Yeah.
actually means is if you consume 20 grams of added sugar a day and all of it was from normal sugar versus all of it was from high fructose corn syrup, you're getting basically 1 gram less of glucose and 1 to 2 grams more of fructose. So this is not a huge difference. So the problem with high fructose corn syrup, and this has actually been very well studied in fructose metabolism, and we can put a link to this study. It has less to do with the effect that it has on like, liver, insulin resistance, etc., and everything else to do with the fact that it is a cheap way to get better tasting, better mouthfeel carbohydrates in our processed foods that then make us consume more calories overall.
Right.
And then when you add that onto like an already, dysfunctional metabolism, that's when it starts to cause issues. It's not the high fructose corn syrup itself specifically.
You're tapping into a conversation or a sort of, a topic that I find very fascinating, which is we have an obesity problem in all parts of the world, right? Certainly here in the US. And one of the reasons people say that we have an obesity problem is because of access to these highly palatable foods that you're talking about. Often they contain high levels of high fructose corn syrup, just as an example, and they're cheap. So I'm the way I look at it is I think carbohydrates in part get a bad rep because of the things that we're talking about, which is, like you said before, not the carbs themselves, but there's a multitude of factors that go into play. Foods that are higher in calories, higher in high fructose corn syrup, are typically cheaper to obtain. They're easy to overeat. They activate the reward centers. Bless you, by the way. You're only allowed 3 sneezes. You can't do a fourth one.
Fourth one is brain damage.
But the the reward center part, right? These things taste good, and the fact that high fructose corn syrup is sweeter feels like that activates the reward center more than other things, and so we crave more of that. Do you think do you see it that way?
Yes. I don't think that's incorrect, but I think that's actually a smaller part of how they're used in the larger context.
Sure.
Have you ever gone to a soda fountain machine and had them be out of soda and it just spits out the syrup and you've taken a sip and it's like, this is too sweet, I don't like it?
Yes, and I have done it where they're out of the syrup and it only spits out
Soda.
carbonated water, which tastes like crap. But continue.
Right. Okay. So that's a good example of when you talk about foods giving you reward and high fructose corn syrup being a part of it, it is a part of the equation of the overall context of that food, right? When you consume a soda, it also has the carbonation, right? And it has engineered to be the perfect spot of sweetness.
Right.
So you want more of it. When you consume high fructose corn syrup in other processed foods like a donut, right? Let's say they use high fructose corn syrup in producing like the pastries, like the pre-made pastries that you buy at the store, right? Those little like mini bear claws or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
Those also are in foods that have engineered the right amount of sweetness, the right amount of like energy density, mouthfeel, crunch. Like they've really just done all of the things to drive you to consume a lot more food. So the fructose is the high fructose corn syrup is a part of the equation of making you consume more of that food in general. So it is part of the overall context of that food. And what's really interesting is if you actually look at those foods, the high fructose corn syrup is probably second or third in terms of the overall amount of energy that it's providing in that food. It's generally the fat content, the flour/starch content, and then the sweetener content in terms of calories.
There's an interesting topic in there that we won't get into today, but I want to just mention it. And that is when you talk about them engineering food to get you to eat more of it, and you ask yourself, well, why would they do that?
Why?
Because they want you to buy more of their, they want you to buy more of their product, right? They want more money. They want you to come back to them. So it's almost like the structure that we've built as a society with the manufacturers of our food is actually completely decoupled from what we actually need. In other words, it's not good for me to encourage you to eat more of this. It's actually harming your health, but I'm doing it because I need you to buy more of my product. Yet in doing so, you sort of damage your health. You know, so like how so much of our food supply is not actually conducive to our health when it encourages you to buy more and consume more, so on and so forth, right? So just that whole concept to me, it's just they don't go, they don't align.
Well, they don't align, but I think it's important to understand the context of a little bit of how we got here. For the largest part of human history, our problem was getting calories was too expensive and we would die.
Hunting and gathering and yeah.
Right. And so the advent of the industrial agriculture, the industrial revolution, all of these things, what it did effectively, like if we boil this down to like the most first principle ways of thinking, it cut the cost of a calorie by orders of magnitude in terms of both the amount of energy we have to spend to get it and the dollar figure it costs us to create that calorie for human consumption. And so what that did is it took us from a species that could having enough energy was a constraint to survival to now it's not. And so once we got there, then it became, okay, we live in a world where we have free markets and free markets go to maximize profits. Mm-hmm. And so what they did was they realized, okay, we can now produce calories so cheaply that's no longer a constraint. What's the constraint on my business now is profits. So how do I now engineer the food to get people to buy more so we can become more profitable in a free market society? And we did that without really thinking about what the second order consequence of that would be. And it turns out the second order consequence of that is we're actually going to kill the people that are consuming our product. So that's kind of how we got here. And now we're like, oh, this actually worked too well. And now we have to unwind the problem from a like society behavior standpoint.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, the way you described that was really good. And that I feel like that could be an entire episode in itself sometime, because that stuff to me and just how we got here over time. I know that's not exactly pertinent to what we're talking about today, but still kind of fits in. Nonetheless, it's really interesting to me. We actually did get, we have some questions we could probably dive into, and let me get to, here's the first one.
Do we want to cover some of the myths before we get into questions, or do you want to tackle some questions first? We can do either one.
You know what? Nope. I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you. I'm getting too far ahead of myself. Yes, we do want to tackle some myths and misconceptions. So starting with the weight gain one. the myth or the misconception is, oh, the carbs make you fat, or carbs just make you balloon up, and all these bad things happen. Let's start with that one. Because realistically, I mean, just eating too much food makes you gain weight, right? It's not necessarily the carbohydrates, but what do we need to know about carbs and their impact on weight?
So this is one of the most interesting parts about current behavior psychology surrounding dieting. And I'll tackle this from two perspectives. The first is, if we look at the deep science of exactly how the body processes carbohydrates, how that affects hormones, how that affects fat storage, all of those things, we know that two things are true. One, over consuming carbohydrates, like if you're in a calorie surplus, over consuming carbohydrates is actually going to cause you to gain less weight than overeating fat.
Yep.
That's 100% been shown to be true. Well, let's just say 99.999, because nothing's ever 100%. The corollary is also true, where if you are in a deficit and if you restrict carbohydrates more than you restrict fat, you lose less weight. So restricting fat calories actually makes you lose more weight than restricting fat calories. We know this with a very high degree of certainty and accuracy. So the science to us doesn't support the idea that carbohydrates make you gain weight any more than any other macronutrient. However, it's so deeply ingrained in consumer psychology that it's almost impossible to give anybody enough data to get them to change their mind. And so this is one of the very interesting things that I've experienced just coaching and seeing people. They have to develop the experiential knowledge before they'll believe you, which means
for sure
they have to, it's like this weird catch-22 of they won't move to a higher carbohydrate, more moderate fat diet while they're losing weight because they're convinced it won't work, but they won't believe you it works until they do it. And so I think for me, just working with clients, that's been one of the hardest things to get them to understand is like, this is not the only road that leads to Rome. And what usually the problem that happens is there's a little bit of this just like a doom loop where somebody has been on very low carbohydrate diets for years and they're stuck in their weight. And you tell them like, hey, we don't need to do this forever. But the problem is they're also running around on a low carbohydrate diet. So they're at like their lowest water weight and they have very little muscle glycogen. So then you tell them, hey, we're going to go to more moderate carbohydrates. The first 2 weeks, their scale weight's probably going to go up because basically go weigh your car, like you can go to like the local dump or whatever, or transfer station, whatever they call it in Minnesota. And you can weigh your car and then go fill it up with gasoline and then go weigh your car. Like you haven't added garbage into your car. You've literally just filled the fuel tank, which is the same thing that happens when you go from a low carb diet to a high carb diet. That was actually shown. This is maybe one of the more ironic things in nutrition science literature in the last probably 10, 15 years. So there was a group of scientists who were convinced that low carb diets were like the holy grail. And so they did a study where they put either carbohydrate restricted diet or a ketogenic or a carbohydrate restricted ketogenic diet or like a low fat diet, had them lose weight, and then they refed them with carbohydrates. And what was wild is the week where they refed them the carbohydrates, they gained like 6 kilos of lean mass. So they're like, oh, look at this. You can go on a ketogenic diet and you can build 6 kilos of muscle. And you're like, no, what you did is at the end of the 10 weeks of dieting, they were so carbohydrate depleted that when you gave them a normal weeks of food, you basically just completely refilled their muscles with glycogen. Like this is also what you see, like when you see people prep for Mr. Olympia. Basically what they do is they diet down and then they get really low carbohydrate. And then they super compensate. They consume a whole bunch of like potassium and carbohydrates to shove as much glycogen and water into their muscle cells so their muscles get huge because they've just basically refilled the muscle cells with carbohydrates and water. And so that's why it can be difficult for people to go from low carb diets to eating more moderate. Is the first 2 weeks they're like, oh my God, I'm gaining weight. It's like, well, no, you're just fixing a problem you caused.
Yeah, and I often had to tell people, like you said, there's no amount of data or anything that you can typically tell them to just get them to believe you. So I would just usually tell people, hey, listen, I need you just to take a leap of faith here. You're not going to believe me until you actually do it. Just if there's one thing you trust me on, just trust me on this and try it. They would dive in, they'd get through the first couple of weeks. Then they'd look in the mirror and be like, actually, I look good. I'm happy I did this. There was nothing to be scared about. So, yeah, great point. The another benefit or benefit, a misconception is that low carb diets. We get people that will say, "I can only lose weight on a low carb diet." What we know with a pretty high degree of certainty is that the people who truly believe that they can only lose weight on low carb, it's a combination of exactly what you just talked about. They're seeing that they lose weight because the water weight falls and glycogen depletion, but also they they they're not doing it, like they've never done calorie counting consistently long enough to actually see that at the end of a month or 2 months or whatever, weight loss is actually the same as long as calorie intake is identical. So you kind of got a couple of things working against them. But as far as these people, the people that say I can only lose weight on low carb diets, let's bust that myth. What's actually going on?
Yeah, I mean, so it's obviously the part of there being water loss, right? The second part is if you just eliminate an entire food group, you don't really have to count calories, at least for the first 6 months,
For a
because
bit, right.
you've restricted so many calories out of your diet that you're going to lose weight. You've basically taken the diligence part of it out of like being aware, and you've just short circuited that. And it's just like, hey, if I just remove 40% of my daily calories, like, of course I'm going to lose weight.
Right. Another myth we've heard and people still believe is that carbs are straight up bad for you. Let's just cut to the chase. Is there any scenario in which carbs are actually bad for you? Whatever you want to define as bad, but any such scenario?
I mean, I think this comes down to the context. So if you are somebody who is 100 pounds overweight, has type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, renal failure, and you're consuming a diet of highly processed carbohydrates, those carbohydrates are probably not doing much to improve your health. If you are a otherwise lean, very physically active individual who's consuming mostly whole food based carbohydrates, like let's say you have a carbohydrate rich diet, like I would say my diet's probably 50 to 60% of my calories are carbohydrates. It comes from oatmeal, rice, potatoes, like artisan bread, like things like that. Those carbohydrates are probably really good for me. But you can see that those are two very different contexts. And part of it has to do with the metabolic situation your body's in. Another has to do with what is the context of the food that you're consuming? And how is that contributing to your overall energy intake, the nutrients you're consuming, the quality of the food you're consuming, etc.
And this is the same concept that we talk about when people talk about, there are good foods or bad foods. It's kind of like food is just food. Carbohydrates they're just carbohydrates. They're not good or bad in and of themselves. It's when they become good or bad, it's dependent on your lifestyle. If all you're drinking is soda all day, then maybe it's probably bad to have another soda, right? To have your 10th soda of the evening or something, right? But if, like you said, I want to have a soda in an otherwise fairly well-balanced diet, no, suddenly that soda doesn't become a problem. It's not, those things are neutral. And it's when you bring context into the equation, then that changes the definition of those things. But in and of themselves, they're not good or bad. So I think you just highlighted a really important part. Well, I think we can take the last. Was there anything else you wanted to go over? I think we can dive into some of the questions that we got from our audience for these last 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
All right. Let me just play this real quick. Do you like that show? This is one of my favorite shows ever. What's that?
I'm so sad that Alex Trebek is gone.
Trebek was the GOAT, man. Did you ever watch when Aaron Rodgers hosted it?
No. I haven't
He
watched
did a great job
since he's been gone. R.I.P.
Such a great show. So one of the first questions we got from our audience was they wanted to know the best types of carbs to have pre-workout and post-workout. Then they also added, is that even a thing? And I always love this question. And we get it still all the time, but I always think it was I always think of this there was this dude who used to go to the gym that I used to go to who he always had gummy bears when he was working out. And then after he went on his way out to the gym, you could see him taking handfuls of gummy bears and pounding them. And this was before I got into like nutrition and fitness myself. But I asked him one time, like, why do you do that? Like, what's with the gummy bears? And he's like, oh, you need a quick, glycogen replenishment after your workout, and gummy bears are basically pure sugar. So I'm just replenishing, my glycogen stores. And what was interesting to me is when I got into nutrition and fitness, you start to find out that it takes a lot more than just a single workout session to deplete your glycogen stores to where they would actually need to be replenished. I mean, I think it was something like you'd have to run, the average person would need to run like 20 miles or something like that to really deplete glycogen stores and need to replenish those. So what's your take on that? Is there a best type of carb to have pre and post workout? Is that actually a thing? Or is this once again context dependent like many things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's context dependent like everything, but I think it's really understanding when, where, and why like pre, during, and post exercise carbohydrates would be beneficial or necessary or what they might do, right? We do know that if you look at all of the like potential ergogenic aids, like ways to improve exercise performance, making sure that you go into exercise fully fueled with carbohydrates is by far the single most effective way, right? So don't go into a workout carbohydrate depleted. So sometimes that means you have to consume a carbohydrate rich snack or meal before you exercise, right? If you don't, let's say you go to bed at 10, you wake up, you don't eat breakfast, and then you go work out at noon, like you're going to be glycogen and carbohydrate low. Like you're not depleted, but you're not going to be optimal. So you need to eat something before if maximum performance is your goal. If you're just trying to skate through a workout, probably going to be fine. Right. On the like flip side of that, and we'll get to intra workout in a minute, but on the flip side, in terms of like glycogen recovery after a workout, there's two things we can basically say, but three things we can say are true. One is you have a window post-exercise that's a couple hours where your rate of glycogen replenishment, so like restoring what you used, is augmented. So if you consume carbohydrates in that window, you're going to recover faster.
Right.
Now, most people will fully recover glycogen, if they are consuming the total amount of carbohydrates they need in a day within 24 hours, right? So if you work out at 8 a.m. today, by noon tomorrow, assuming you meet your daily carbohydrate needs, your recovery is going to be just fine. So you don't have to get it in that window. Now, if you work out at 10 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock at night, and you have an event the next morning, like that post-workout carbohydrate consumption is going to be more important because you're going to accelerate that recovery process. Right. 2, we do know that in post-workout recovery, simple carbohydrates are going to be more effective than complex carbohydrates. In fact, one of the most interesting / controversial sports nutrition studies that's been done within the last decade, actually somebody I've collaborated with before, they took athletes and they basically exercised them to glycogen deplete them, and then they gave them like highly processed foods, like they literally fed them McDonald's, or they gave them like super engineered sports supplements that have like complex carbohydrates and stuff. And the highly processed food actually was much better at restoring or about the same or a little bit better. I'd have to go look at it, but basically the processed food was just as good or better than the sports supplements. So the total calories and the availability of the carbohydrates trumps everything else. That doesn't mean you should go eat McDonald's post exercise, but what it basically goes to show is the basic physics and biology of glycogen is easily available carbohydrates that are digested faster and make it into your muscles faster. Pretty simple.
You just crushed my day.
Now, in the context of your overall like diet, make good choices. Intra workout, probably what we know is if you're doing moderate to moderately vigorous activity, you probably don't need to consume carbohydrates during your workout unless it's about an hour or more.
So like the basketball kids that you work with, they would benefit from Gatorade replenishment throughout the game because that's
Most of them
those
during
situations makes
practice,
sense.
I make them
Yeah.
consume, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates an hour. It'd be ideal if I could get them to do more, but like telling coach to stop practice so I
They
can
don't-
make them consume something would not go over well.
Do they listen to you or not always?
I just hand it to them and make them drink it. Sometimes they're like, no, I'm not doing it. But
What is carb cycling and how let me rephrase that, and how is it or how is it not beneficial?
from a weight loss perspective, carb cycling doesn't really do much. Like manipulating insulin hormone
Right.
levels to try to accelerate fat loss doesn't do anything.
Wow.
For all intents and purposes. Now, where it can be beneficial and where I have used this with clients or athletes is if you are somebody who has 3 to 4 really hard, heavy workouts a week and you're on a calorie restricted diet because you're trying to lose weight, loading your carbohydrates on the days that you have very heavy exercise can allow you to extract the most amount of performance and recovery from those training sessions while still getting some of the benefits of being in a calorie deficit, right? So it'd basically be like if you train super hard Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, and we have, I'm just going to say 12,000 calories available through the week. And of those, say 50%, so 6,000 calories of those are going to be carbohydrates during a week. I'm probably going to load 60 to 70% of them on those 3 days because that's like, I can make sure I'm ready to train. I can train super hard, super long, and then I can recover. And then on the next day, I can go lower carbohydrates. So it's more of just like balancing metabolic load throughout a week than it is trying to maximize weight loss.
Yeah. So what I would tell people is carb cycle if you want to, if it helps you adhere to your overall calorie intake better, but don't do it if you're under the assumption that it's going to produce more fat loss or that it's going to have any inherent benefit.
Yeah.
Next question is, how do carbs affect muscle growth and recovery?
It's incredibly hard to build muscle tissue without an adequate amount of carbohydrates without substantial pharmaceutical help.
So you would need to, so going low carb, if you're going to build muscle, you would need to have illegal substances aiding you essentially. Because, and is that, the carbohydrates is that just because again of the energy they provide and it makes it so that the like protein, for example, like carbs are protein sparing, right? I mean, if you have carbs, like that's essentially what you're doing is you're allowing the other macronutrients, aka protein, to go more toward building your muscle, which is what you want them to do. Is that may be simplified, but is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons. Another reason is you have to train sufficiently hard to elicit muscle growth. So if you don't have a decent amount of carbohydrates in your diet, it's hard to train at that level for an extended period of time. So that's the second reason. And then the third reason is it's also pretty hard to eat enough calories if you have a very low carbohydrate diet. So it's kind of those three reasons. 1, training. 2, enough calories. 3, it's protein sparing. And then 4 is like the insulin, IGF, anti-catabolic effects that it may have. A little bit of that too, but I think that's probably the least important of those 4 in my opinion.
Are there any carbs that cause bloating? Any specific types? Are you aware of any that inherently cause bloating? Because it's interesting to me because when people say that, I always kind of I attribute it probably to more. It must have something to do with FODMAPs, for example, right? Rather than the carbohydrates themselves.
Well, I think it's very individual, right? So like some people, like people who are lactose intolerant will often get bloating from lactose, which is a simple
Yeah,
sugar, right?
sure. Yeah, that's
Some
fair.
people who have some GI gut dysbiosis issues when they consume any sort of oligosaccharide, which is like a
Yeah,
medium chain, kind of like fiber is considered that.
it's fiber.
That's
Right,
where
yeah.
those basically feed your gut bacteria. So what they'll do is they will chew up that bacteria and spit out gas. So that causes bloating. And then just like some people, when they eat starch, like for some reason, whether it's they don't have great digestion, their gut bacteria will metabolize some of that starch. Like it just depends. It's very individual. Like some people, and it'll change over time. Like sometimes you're super sensitive to certain things and sometimes you're not.
We have some people that wanted to know that I think some of our diabetic viewers are interested in here. This is I guess, a 2 or 3 part question, but I'll ask it all at once. Should I avoid certain carbs if I have diabetes? And if a person is pre-diabetic, do they need to go low carb? To what extent, if any, will carbs affect a person's pre-diabetic diagnosis or insulin resistance?
So this is talking more about type 2.
Okay, right.
So type 1 would be a totally different story. So that's insulin deficient, not so that's basically somebody's body doesn't produce insulin anymore,
Right,
not
right,
insulin
right.
resistant.
Mhm.
So just very different, entirely different metabolic programming that's occurring. Like
Right.
the code is different, so to speak. I mean, generally speaking, when you have type 2 diabetes, you actually end up having a fat metabolism problem, not a carbohydrate metabolism problem. And that may sound counterintuitive, but if you go, we have course.macrozinc.net. Like there's a free course that kind of describes this in detail.
And we did a podcast on it.
And we did do a podcast on it. But what I would tell you is, in order of importance, it's going to be the energy balance of your diet is going to be the most important. Your physical activity is going to be this thing of second importance. The overall quality of the food is going to be third. So if I were to re-say this, total calories, total physical activity, the overall quality of the food you're consuming, and then probably I would even probably think about the fat sources you're consuming. And then I would think about the carbohydrate sources you're consuming specifically. Because if you're in an energy deficit, you're losing weight, which means your insulin resistance is improving. If you are physically active, you're improving your overall insulin sensitivity. If you're eating a high quality diet, you've removed a large portion of the added sugars and processed sugars, which again is the general context of the diet. Fourth, if you are being mindful of the types of fats that you're consuming, you're kind of decreasing some of the potential effects of things like diets high in saturated fat and trans fats that can affect insulin sensitivity. And then you're going to start thinking about the individual carbohydrates and whether it's like, oh, if I'm consuming starch versus simple sugars, like things like that. In my mind, and the way I understand that entire process, that's how I would prioritize those. So it actually ends up being much lower on the priority list than you would think. What is that from?
Just a random button bar I found. Not even sure what it's from. We're squeezing it pretty close to the time limit here. Do you have time for one more? Or do you think we should wrap it up?
How quick is it?
This one, it should be pretty quick. Is it true that carbs make you gain fat more easily?
No, they don't. In fact, if you look at studies where they overfeed people carbohydrates versus fat, you gain less fat tissue over consuming carbohydrates than you do fats.
We talked about this in one of the previous episodes. I don't recall specifically which one, but it was basically that you had to severely overeat carbohydrates before they would be stored as fat. Like it was like a ridiculous amount. I don't remember what it was, but
yes,
but it was a lot.
You're a lot.
So that's true. That I think concludes today's episode. I hope you guys all learned a lot. I hope that at this point you guys are not afraid to eat carbs if you were before. Just go eat all the carbs. Brad said you could eat McDonald's. McDonald's has a chicken Big Mac right now, apparently. So go eat.
What?
Yeah,
Ugh.
it's a Big Mac, but with just
That
your
does not
reaction.
sound good at all. Like that sounds terrible.
I mean, it's no Arby's. I know you're a big Arby's fan.
Oh god, we actually just had a meeting where we talked about Arby's.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's who I heard it from. All they said was Brad really wanted Arby's.
Which the context of that was, this is going to be a shameless plug for our new food logging app, Macro Sync, spelled MACRO
There's no
space
shame.
SYNC.
No shame there.
Where I was telling them that I was manually going through and updating our verified foods list database, and we added Arby's to it because people in the group requested Arby's, and I made the joke of like, who actually eats at Arby's? And Jay gave a story of when he was like 18 and basically he just lived on the Arby's 5 for $5, and I was like, CJ, you are the psychotic people who keep this place in business. So it was just a funny joke, and the fact that it now got brought up on this is I haven't thought about Arby's in a long time, and it's been brought up twice today. So I don't
surprise me that he's said he lived on 5x5s. It was that, and then the Little Caesars $5 pizzas back in the day that he told me about. He would just he'd go buy a $5 pizza and eat the whole thing.
My roommate in college did that.
It's so bad. It's such bad pizza. I'm going to wrap this up by saying, if you guys missed the beginning of this episode, I wanted you to see the picture I drew of Brad Dieter. This is when he gets upset with people in meetings. That's how he looks. Yep. So don't piss off Brad Dieter. That's all I can say. All right. That concludes this episode. To everyone who watched, thank you. We'll be back again next week, barring any unforeseen circumstances. Next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central. And until then, we're outie.
Same macro time, same macro channel.
Bye-bye.